This is the video for the first video for the history of cognitive psychology, as you can actually see from the screen right here. Why are we bothering to go through the history of cognitive psychology? Well, it actually informs you to a certain extent about why we look at things the way we look at them in cognitive psychology, and also gives you some perspective in that cognitive psychology has been viewed differently over time, and some of the thoughts about cognitive psychology have informed our current views of cognitive psychology. Also, not this particular video, but a couple of the other videos right after it on the history of the cognitive psychology. We'll also talk about the paradigms and techniques that are actually used to engage in cognitive psychology and figure out how the mind actually works. And that also will set you up for the rest of the semester, where you're going to be able to, you see these things and sort of understand the context in which they're happening. So what is cognitive psychology? Basically, it's a field of psychology, okay. Basically, it's a field of psychology that examines the processes that manipulate sensory information. So essentially information coming in from the environment, and then also information coming from within as well. And so with this information coming in, how is that information transformed into thoughts that we have? How we have a ton of information that's actually coming in, but we aren't aware of all of that. So how does it reduce that information? The information that's there, we add stuff to the information, so we elaborate on it. The information stored, when it's stored, lots of times we want to recover it for tests, things like that. And how do we use the information? How do we apply it to be able to function within the world? Now, cognitive psychology is actually one of the younger disciplines. I'm hesitating right here because there are younger disciplines, but this is a solid, every university with the psychology department has to have a cognitive psychology course, just like you have to have a personality course. It's a fundamental part of human behavior, and so it's very important that we study that. However, cognitive psychology as we know it now actually only started in the 1950s, and in this video I'll actually talk a little bit about why that's the case. So it's fairly young and how long it's been around. One of the reasons that cognitive psychology is important is because it influences a lot of other different fields. Actually, maybe some of you who are interested in being in clinical psychology are actually taking this because cognitive psychology actually helps with some of that, because some cognitive components, cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, are important if you're going to be a clinical psychologist. Social psychology also looks at cognitive psychology. Specifically, there's a sub-branch of social psychology that's social cognition. We actually offer a course of social cognition here at Oakland University. Also, instructional and organizational psychology also is affected by cognitive psychology, because a lot of things with teaching, and then also how you how people perform in an organizational setting is informed a lot by cognitive psychology. So we're going to start with a history lesson. Aristotle was actually the first empiricist, so way, way, way back. This was 385 to 322, so BC. And he was one of the first people to actually claim that careful observation was the key to getting knowledge. So how do we get information about the world? The memories that we have and the thoughts that we have, where do they come from? Aristotle's basically arguing that it's from observing things, observing the world. And another thing that he contributed is that conclusions need to be based on inductions from those observations. So these, you see these observations, and then you sort of think, okay, if this is true, then this also must be true. So you get the conclusions from that. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we're talking about reasoning. But empiricism isn't, well, it's science. It's one of the groundworks for science. So empiricism means that you have knowledge that's being obtained through observation. So you make observations and you induce things from that, laws or behaviors or things like that. Now, on the other side of it is that you have rationalism. Now, Aristotle was a philosopher, but he was empiricist as a philosopher. Other types of philosophers might be rationalists. So a lot of people in the philosophy department take this particular approach. So rationalism is basically getting knowledge through logic and inference from existing knowledge. So it's like, if this is true and this is true, then this other thing is true. Both of these together form the foundation of the scientific method. And so these are different ways that we can actually know things about the world. Aristotle also proposed philosophy of mind. He was really interested in this, and he was one of the first ones to say that the mind is a blank state, tabula rasa. Basically, when we're born, we have no knowledge. So knowledge is not innate. Now, this is actually controversial because there are some people who think that maybe we're born with certain types of knowledge, and that knowledge informs, the way we interact with the world. But Aristotle is basically saying that it's not innate. We learn everything, or all the knowledge that we have comes through learning. And these experiences are the basis of that. So basically, these experiences that you have in the world form the basis of thought and reasoning. The mind is a product of experience. So all our thoughts and all the things that we know is because we're experiencing things from the world from the moment that we're born, probably even before we're born. Now, his interest in memory, he was so interested in it actually that he wrote, it's not a book actually, but several scrolls on concerning memory and reminiscence. And he was basically saying that what memory is doing is recording your experiences, and it holds those experiences so that you can retrieve them at a later time. And so this concerning memory of reminiscence, what he wrote about was the first recorded theory of human memory and cognition. So he was the first cognitive psychologist, you could say. Now, we move further in the timeline. I'm going to talk about Descartes. Why are we talking about him in cognitive psychologist? Because he's a rationalist. And basically, he was one of the first ones to question the nature of truth and reality. He's the one that says, I think, therefore I am. Basically, he's reasoning he's like, I have these thoughts. It's undeniable that I have these thoughts. And because of that I have these thoughts, and I'm aware of these thoughts, that means I must exist. That's, I think, therefore I am. And so early cognitive psychologists needed to reason from the fact of existence to thought and awareness. And basically, he's actually going the other direction, he's saying that I have thought and awareness, so therefore I must exist. Something has to be having these thoughts. The scientific revolution takes parts of empiricism and rationalism and puts them together, like I said before. This is where empiricism actually flourished. Everybody started making empirical observations instead of, basically having the priests say this is what's true or not true, or superstitions and things like that. It's basically in the pre-scientific revolution, it's religious dogma was the way you answered questions about reality. When we hit this particular time point, no, we can answer these questions or learn about the world through making observations. And so the scientific method was developed then, and it involved both careful observation. Well, careful observation was one of the most important parts of it, the empiricism part of it. And that's the way we actually used, the technique we actually use to answer questions, important questions. Like I said, the empirical method also has rationalism as well, because, through logic, you make these observations, and through logic, you can say, well, if this is true and this is true, then this should also be true. Then you make some observations to test to see if that's true. The last one that I'm going to touch upon in terms of the history of cognitive psychology up to, the psychology part of it was British associationism. This was a school of thought that emphasized empiricism. So it was coming out of the scientific movement, rationalism, and all of that. And basically, they, once again, also thought that empiricism was really, really important to knowing about the world. And basically, he says the driving force behind, human behavior and the mind is the experience. And so this particular thought was actually in the 1900s, or late 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of scientific discoveries and medical discoveries and things like that actually were happening at that time because of British associationism and their focus on empiricism and also the scientific revolution. And they spawned many researchers, one of them being Wundt, which we're going to talk about in the next video.